He built her a chair before he ever knew her name. In 1883, on a stretch of Montana prairie so remote that neighbors were measured in miles rather than houses, a man named Silas Rowan dragged two rocking chairs onto an unfinished porch and sat down in one of them. Just one. The other he left empty. His closest neighbor, a weathered cattle rancher named Dutch Holloway, rode past that afternoon, saw the empty chair, and laughed until his horse shifted beneath him. "Who's that for, Silas? Your ghost?" Silas didn't answer. He just kept rocking. That empty chair would wait nearly 3 years. And what came to fill it would change both their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted or survived alone. This is their story. Stay with me until the end, and drop your city in the comments below so I can see how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1883 arrived in Calhoun Flats, Montana, the way most things arrived in that part of the country, without announcement and without mercy. The heat came first, rolling off the eastern ridges in long, slow waves that turned the grass pale and made the distant hills look like they were breathing. Then came the wind, the kind that didn't cool anything but simply moved the heat around from one place to another, as if redistributing suffering more evenly across the landscape. By mid-July, the creek that ran along the southern boundary of Silas Rowan's property had dropped to a thin silver thread barely wide enough to wet a boot, and the wildflowers his mother had always called prairie stars had curled up and gone brown along the fence line. Silas didn't mind the heat the way most men did. He'd grown up in it, or something close enough to it, back in Kansas before his father lost the family farm to a banker who wore a three-piece suit and never once looked Silas's mother in the eye when he explained why they had to leave. That experience, watching his father sign papers at the kitchen table with his jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin, had taught Silas two things early in life. The first was that land mattered more than almost anything, and the second was that you had to be careful about who you trusted to stand beside you on it. He was 33 years old now, and he'd spent the better part of 5 years building something on this particular stretch of Montana ground that was by any reasonable measure a solid if not spectacular achievement. 40 acres under cultivation, a barn with a sound roof, a root cellar dug deep enough to keep vegetables through February, a well that hadn't gone dry even in the worst summer anyone in Calhoun Flats could remember, though Dutch Holloway liked to remind people that his memory for weather was selective at best. The house itself was still unfinished in places. The back bedroom had gaps between the boards that let in light in the morning and cold in the winter, and the kitchen window frame had warped slightly over the first hard winter, so that the glass sat at a very faint angle that nobody but Silas ever seemed to notice. The front porch, though. The front porch was done. It had been the first thing he'd finished with any real care, which was the detail that confused people most about Silas Rowan. Most homesteaders built what they needed first: the roof to keep out rain, the door to keep out wind, the stove to keep out cold. You built toward comfort, toward survival, toward the bare minimum that kept you breathing and functional. You didn't build a porch first. A porch was something you built when everything else was done, when you'd earned the right to sit down and look at what you'd made. But Silas had his reasons, and he kept them mostly to himself. The two rocking chairs had come from a woodworker in the town of Harlow, 22 miles southeast, a German man named Becker who did clean work and never charged more than he quoted. Silas had commissioned them in the spring of his second year on the land, before the barn roof was entirely secured and long before the root cellar was dug. He'd ridden out to Harlow on a Thursday morning and sat across from old Becker in the sawdust-smelling workshop and described exactly what he wanted. Not decorative, not delicate, chairs built to last through seasons, built to hold a person's weight without complaint, built to be sat in hard and long and often. 2 of them, Silas had said. Becker had looked at him. "You've got a wife coming?" "Not yet." The old woodworker had scratched the back of his neck and written the order down without further comment, which was one of the things Silas appreciated about him. When the chairs arrived, strapped across the back of a neighbor's wagon who'd been making the trip anyway, Silas carried them up to the porch himself and set them side by side, angled slightly toward each other, the way his parents' chairs had always been angled back in Kansas. His mother and father used to sit out in the evenings after supper, not always talking, sometimes not talking at all, just present in the same space with the same view, and there had been something in that quiet companionship that Silas had filed away somewhere important and never quite forgotten. He sat in the left one. He always sat in the left one. The right one he left alone. Dutch Holloway came by that first week, as Dutch Holloway always eventually came by, drawn by some rancher's instinct for other people's business. He rode up on his big roan gelding, squinted at the porch, and took a long moment to register what he was seeing. "That other chair for company?" Dutch asked. "Someday," Silas said. "You got somebody in mind?" "Not specifically." Dutch worked his jaw like he was chewing something tough. He was a man in his mid-50s with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same material as the surrounding landscape, rough, sun-damaged, and shaped by forces largely outside his control. He'd buried a wife 12 years ago and hadn't remarried, and he had opinions about the romantic prospects of men who spent too much time alone on the prairie. He shared these opinions freely and without particular sensitivity. "You know," Dutch said, "most men in your situation go to a social, meet a widow woman, work things out from there. There's a widow over in Crane Creek, the Halverson woman. She's got good teeth and her own chickens." "I appreciate that," Silas said, "but you're not interested." "I didn't say that. You've got that look." Silas kept rocking. "What look?" "The look of a man who's already decided something and is just waiting for the world to catch up." Dutch shook his head slowly, the way men do when they've identified a situation they consider beyond correction. "That chair's going to sit empty a long time, friend." "Maybe," Silas said, "but it'll be there when it's needed." Dutch muttered something under his breath that was probably impolite and rode on. Silas watched him go, then turned back to the prairie stretching out ahead of him, golden and vast and silent, except for the grass moving in the wind. He didn't feel foolish. He didn't feel lonely exactly, though loneliness was present the way a dull ache is present. Not always demanding attention, but never entirely gone either. What he felt, mostly, was patient. And patience, in his experience, was a thing you either had or you didn't. You couldn't manufacture it. You couldn't borrow it. You either trusted that the right thing was worth waiting for, or you didn't, and Silas Rowan had decided, somewhere along the way, that he did. The idea came to him on a wet October evening when the rain was coming sideways off the mountains, and he was sitting alone at the kitchen table with a lantern and a 2-week-old copy of the Harlow Territorial Gazette that a passing rider had left in the box at the end of his road. He'd read most of it already. The news, the livestock prices, the brief and sad account of a family whose wagon had overturned crossing the Marias River, and he'd turned to the back pages where the classifieds ran in small, close columns. Personal advertisements. They were a common enough feature in frontier newspapers, though they carried a particular social stigma in some circles. A man who advertised for a wife was either desperate or eccentric or both, and the women who responded were viewed with equal suspicion, either too plain or too peculiar to find a husband through the normal channels. Silas had read these columns before with the detached curiosity he applied to most things he had no immediate use for. But that evening, with the rain coming down hard and the empty chair visible through the doorway where he'd left it on the porch, he read them differently. Most of the advertisements were unremarkable. They described men who were, according to their own accounts, hardworking, God-fearing, and financially stable, seeking women who were domestic, pleasant-natured, and of good moral character. They were, in other words, descriptions of people who almost certainly didn't exist in the exact form advertised, seeking other people who probably didn't exist either. They were transactions dressed up in the language of romance, and they had all the warmth and specificity of a livestock notice. Silas stared at the page for a long time. Then he got out a piece of paper and began to write. He didn't describe himself as prosperous, because he wasn't, not yet. He didn't claim to be particularly charming, because he knew he wasn't. He didn't promise comfort or security, because the frontier didn't allow for those kinds of promises. What he wrote instead was something closer to a reckoning, an honest account of a man and a place, and a particular vision of what a life together might look like if both people were willing to work toward it without pretending it would be easy. He wrote that he was 33, in good health, and in possession of 40 acres that were productive but still being shaped. That the house was solid but unfinished in parts. That the winters were hard in ways that people from the East sometimes underestimated. That he was not a man who talked much, but that he thought deeply about things that mattered, and that what mattered most to him was building something that would last, not just crops or structures, but a household in the genuine sense of the word. He wrote that he was not looking for a woman who could cook 3 meals a day and keep a clean floor, though those things had their value. He was looking for a partner who understood that frontier life asked something profound of the people who chose it, and who was willing to be asked without resentment. And at the bottom, after 3 drafts and half a dozen crossed-out sentences, he wrote the line that he would never be entirely sure how to explain, even to himself. "There's a second rocking chair on my porch. It has been waiting longer than I have, and it will wait as long as necessary." He sent the advertisement to 3 papers: the Harlow Territorial Gazette, the Great Falls Tribune, and on a slight impulse he couldn't entirely justify, a Chicago paper called the Midwest Daily Register that he'd seen mentioned in a letter from a cousin back east. Then he went back to work and tried not to think about it. The first responses arrived in November, which surprised him. He hadn't expected much from the advertisement, had half convinced himself it was a foolish thing to have done, and had already begun constructing a private explanation for why it hadn't worked that preserved as much of his dignity as possible. But the letters came. Not a flood. Nothing like the volumes he'd heard some men received when they advertised in the big Eastern papers. 17 letters over the course of 3 weeks. A manageable and slightly deflating number that suggested his advertisement had reached people without exciting them to any great degree. He read each one at the kitchen table by lamplight, giving each its due consideration, trying to be fair and honest in his assessment. Most of them were kind. Several were clearly written by women responding to multiple advertisements simultaneously, the way you might send a resume to several employers. The personal details swapped in like interchangeable parts. A few were genuinely touching. Women in difficult circumstances, widows with children, women whose lives had not gone the way they'd planned, and who were looking for something solid to hold on to. He felt tenderness for those, and something like guilt, because he knew without being able to say exactly why that what they were looking for was not precisely what he was offering. He wrote back to 3 of them. He was honest about his situation and honest about what he was looking for. 2 of the 3 never responded, which he understood. The third wrote back a pleasant letter that led to a pleasant exchange of 5 or 6 letters over 2 months, at the end of which they both acknowledged, without drama, that they were not right for each other. She was looking for something more settled. He was looking for something more willing to be unsettled. By February, the correspondence had gone quiet, and Silas was beginning to revise his understanding of what patience meant in practical terms. Maybe patience had limits after all. Maybe Dutch Holloway and his Halverson widow were not such a foolish idea. He was thinking something close to this on a Tuesday evening in late February when the mail rider came up the road in the cold with a single letter tucked into the leather bag. A letter from Chicago, written on good paper in a handwriting that was precise without being ornate. The handwriting of someone who worked with words professionally and had stopped trying to make them look prettier than they were. He read it once quickly and then sat very still for a moment. Then he read it again, slowly, from the beginning. Margaret Ellison had found the advertisement by accident. This was important to her later when she told the story, that she hadn't been looking. She hadn't placed herself in the path of the advertisement with any particular intention. She'd been sitting in the offices of the Midwest Daily Register on a Thursday afternoon in November, supervising the reset of a stuck press drum that one of the apprentices had jammed with a piece of furniture type, and someone had left a copy of that day's paper folded open on the counter beside her elbow. She'd glanced at it during a pause in the work, and her eye had moved through the columns the way eyes do when the mind is half occupied with something else, skimming without committing. She'd almost missed it. What stopped her was the phrase about the rocking chair, not the land or the description of the man or any of the practical details. Those she'd barely registered. It was that single strange sentence at the bottom about the chair on the porch that had been waiting longer than he had, and would wait as long as necessary. And something in it snagged at her in a way she found difficult to explain even to herself. It wasn't that it was romantic exactly. She was not a woman who used that word easily or trusted what it usually pointed to. She was 27 years old, the oldest child of a printing family, the only one of her father's 3 children who had shown any aptitude for the business, and she had spent the better part of the last 8 years becoming indispensable to an operation that everyone around her assumed would pass to a son her father didn't have. She'd earned her position through a combination of competence and stubbornness and a willingness to work longer hours than anyone around her, and she'd paid for it in the ways such things are always paid for, with time and freedom and the gradual narrowing of her social life to colleagues and family and not much else. She wasn't unhappy. That was what she always told herself. And there was truth in it, enough truth to make the other thing, the persistent undercurrent of a life that felt like it was happening just slightly adjacent to what it was supposed to be, easy enough to ignore most of the time. She read the advertisement again. Then she folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket and went back to supervising the press drum repair. She didn't think about it, consciously, for the rest of the afternoon. But she took the paper home. She wrote the letter 3 weeks later. She'd started it 5 times and thrown away 4 attempts, not because she was struggling for things to say, but because she kept saying too much, or the wrong things, or things that sounded in her own ears like someone performing sincerity rather than demonstrating it. She was good at writing. It was part of her work, part of what made her valuable in the position she'd built. And that very competence kept tripping her up because she kept reaching for the right effect when what she needed was simply the truth laid flat. The 5th draft she wrote quickly, without stopping to assess it, and that was the one she sent. She told him she was 27 and worked as the supervising editor of a printing operation she did not own, but effectively ran. She told him she was not domestic in the ways the word usually implied. She could not sew particularly well. Her cooking was functional rather than inspired, and she had no experience with livestock or agriculture beyond what she'd read in books, which she suspected was not the same thing at all. She told him she was independent to a degree that some people found inconvenient, and that she had no particular intention of changing that, though she was willing to discuss what it meant in a specific context. She told him that she was not responding to his advertisement as a transaction. She was responding because the thing he'd written about the chair had struck her as either the most peculiar thing she'd read all year or the most honest, and she hadn't been able to decide which, and that uncertainty had bothered her enough that she'd concluded the only way to resolve it was to write and find out. She did not tell him she was beautiful, because she didn't think in those terms about herself. And she didn't tell him she was plain because she thought that kind of preemptive self-deprecation was its own form of manipulation. She described herself in the way she might describe a piece of machinery, accurately, without either flattery or apology. Medium height, dark hair that she wore practically rather than elaborately, dark eyes that people said were too serious for a woman her age, strong hands from years of press work. And at the bottom, I'm not sure what I'm looking for, which I realize is not what you asked. But I think honesty about uncertainty is more useful than false certainty, and the tone of your advertisement suggested you might agree. Silas read that line 4 times. He wrote back the following Sunday, which was 3 days after the letter arrived, and he used those 3 days the way he used most things, carefully and without rushing. He told her she was right about the chair. It was peculiar. He'd known that when he built it, and he'd built it anyway, and he'd placed the advertisement knowing it was peculiar too, and the reason he'd done both things was that he'd found, in his experience, that peculiar things were more often honest than ordinary ones, and honesty seemed to him the only reasonable foundation for anything that was supposed to last. He told her about the land, not the way a man trying to impress someone describes land, not in terms of its potential value or its future yield, but in the way you describe something you love to someone who might understand it, the way the light moved across the grass in the late afternoon, the way the weather came in from the mountains with sometimes only 20 minutes warning, the way the silence could feel, depending on the day and your state of mind, either like freedom or like punishment, and how learning to tell the difference was maybe the most important skill the frontier required. He told her that he didn't know exactly what he was looking for either, and that he'd been sitting with that uncertainty long enough to feel reasonably comfortable inside it. He said that what he did know was that he was looking for someone who understood the difference between a life that was easy and a life that was good, and who was not confused about which of those two things was worth working toward. He told her he'd like to continue writing if she was willing. She was willing. What followed was months of letters that were, from the beginning, unlike anything either of them had experienced or expected. The correspondence moved quickly past the usual frontier of small talk and cautious presentation that most such exchanges settled into. Margaret was constitutionally incapable of sustained small talk. She simply didn't have the patience for writing things she didn't mean, and after the first 2 exchanges, she stopped trying entirely and started writing the way she thought, which was directly and with a kind of intellectual restlessness that jumped between topics. Practical observations about her work, longer meditations on things she'd read or noticed, or found herself unable to stop turning over in her mind. Silas, for his part, wrote back in kind. He was not a fast writer. His letters took time, and the handwriting showed it. A careful, deliberate script that occasionally featured a word crossed out and replaced. But what he produced was considered in a way that Margaret found unexpectedly compelling. He didn't perform thoughtfulness. He didn't write the things he thought she wanted to hear. He pushed back on ideas he disagreed with, asked questions that required real answers, and once, in April, 4 months into their exchange, told her that something she'd said about her father's business was wrong in a way that was going to cost her, and explained why with a clarity that irritated her considerably until she realized he was completely correct. She wrote back, "You're right, and I hate that you're right, which means you're definitely right." He wrote back, "I've learned that the thing that makes you angriest is usually the thing that matters most." They didn't discuss love. They didn't use the word. They circled around the center of what they were doing without naming it, the way you might walk around a fire to feel its warmth from different angles. And there was in this circumspection something that felt to both of them more honest than a direct declaration would have. They were building an argument, not a romantic argument, but a practical one, a case for why these two specific, flawed, and somewhat difficult people might make sense together in the same particular space. By June, the argument was fairly convincing. Then Margaret's father had a stroke. She wrote it on a Thursday night, 2 days after her father came home from the hospital with a weakened left side and a prognosis that was guardedly described by his physician as requiring adjustment to expectations. Her brother Thomas, who was younger by 4 years and had an excellent talent for being elsewhere when things became difficult, had taken one look at the situation and retreated to his lodgings on the pretext of consulting a business contact. Her younger sister Clara had wept productively and then gone home to her husband and children. Margaret had stayed. She stayed because someone had to, and because she was the oldest, and because she loved her father in the particular unsentimental way she loved most things. Not without warmth, but without the theatrical demonstrations of warmth that other people seemed to require in order to believe affection was real. Her father knew she loved him. She knew he knew. They didn't perform it for each other, and that had always been enough. The letter to Silas was the hardest thing she'd written in months, harder than the first one she'd sent him, which had at least been driven by a kind of reckless honesty. This one required a different kind of honesty, the kind that acknowledged a truth you didn't want to acknowledge, about limits and obligations, and the way that doing the right thing sometimes meant giving up something you'd started to want very badly. She told him what had happened. She told him what it meant, that she couldn't leave, not now, not with any decency, because her father's business would collapse without management, and her father himself would be diminished in a way that went beyond the physical if he watched it collapse. She told him she didn't know how long. She told him she understood if this changed things. She did not ask him to wait. She thought asking him to wait would be a kind of presumption she hadn't earned and couldn't justify. And she would rather release him from the implicit arrangement between them cleanly than hold on to him by obligation. What she didn't put in the letter, because she wasn't entirely sure yet that it was true enough to put in writing, was that something about the prospect of not seeing Montana and not sitting in that second chair had produced in her a feeling that was difficult to categorize, but that functioned in her chest and her stomach, and her general orientation toward the future, an awful lot like grief. She sealed the letter and sent it, and then sat at her father's bedside while he slept, with a business ledger open on her lap and a pen in her hand, working through the numbers that would keep the operation running, and she was almost entirely focused on the ledger. Almost. The letter reached him on a warm evening in early July, and he read it twice and then sat with it for a long time in the left rocking chair while the light went out of the sky over the prairie. The second chair was there beside him, the way it always was, and for the first time since he'd put it on the porch, he found himself looking at it differently, not as a statement of intent, but as a simple empty piece of furniture on a porch in Montana, which was all it was, really, when you stripped the idea away from it. Dutch Holloway rode by the next morning, as if sensing, in the way old ranchers sometimes seem to sense things, that something had shifted. "You look like a man who got news," Dutch said from the road. "I got a letter," Silas said. "From the woman?" "Yes." Dutch got down from his horse and came up to the porch and leaned against the railing and looked at the empty chair. "Bad news?" Complicated news, Silas said. Her father's sick. She's staying behind to manage things. Dutch was quiet for a moment. How long? She doesn't know. And she's asking you to wait? She's not asking me anything. That's the thing. Silas folded the letter and set it on the arm of the chair. She's letting me go. Dutch worked his jaw. Well, he said finally, that's either a very good sign or a very bad one. Which do you think? The old man was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the prairie with the expression he wore when he was being more honest than usual. I think, he said, that a woman who lets you go rather than holding on out of need is either not interested enough to hold on or interested enough to not want to hold you by obligation. He paused. You'd know better than me which one it is. Silas thought about the letters, about the argument she'd made about his soil drainage that was wrong in one specific way she hadn't known enough to know, about the way she'd told him she was right about her error. I hate that you're right. About the letters she'd sent in March describing her father's print shop in the kind of specific, loving detail that people only produce when they're trying to describe something to someone they think will understand it. I know which one it is, he said. Then you know what you're doing, Dutch said. I'm going to write her back and tell her nothing has changed. Dutch looked at him. Nothing? The land is here. The house is here. Silas looked at the empty chair. The chair is here. None of that's going anywhere. Dutch made a sound that might have been admiration or might have been exasperation. With Dutch, the two were often audibly indistinguishable. He got back on his horse and rode on. Silas went inside and sat at the kitchen table and wrote the letter. He told her that he'd read what she'd written, and he understood it, and he respected it, and that none of what she'd said changed his situation or his thinking. He told her the land wasn't going anywhere. He told her he wasn't going anywhere. He told her the chair would be there. He didn't make it a romantic declaration. He made it a simple statement of fact, because it was a simple statement of fact, and he trusted her enough to know that she would understand the difference. The months that followed were not, despite what the distance and the silence might suggest, easy months. Silas was not a man who complained easily or indulged the self-pity that frontier life offered in abundant supply. But he was also not a man who pretended to feel things he didn't feel or didn't feel things that were genuinely there, and what was genuinely there, through the late summer and the fall and the first brutal winter, was an absence that had the specific weight of something real rather than the lighter weight of something merely hypothetical. He worked. That was what you did. You worked because the work didn't stop because you were lonely, and because work was at least honest in its demands. It asked for your body and your attention and gave back something visible and measurable in return. He finished the back bedroom, filling in the gaps between the boards until the morning light stopped leaking through. He dug an extension on the root cellar. He spent a solid week in October regrading the eastern field because Margaret had been right in that letter back in March about the drainage issue he'd dismissed. She wrote to him still, not as frequently as before, because her days were consumed by the print shop management and her evenings by her father's rehabilitation and the general domestic reorganization that a serious illness imposes on a household. But she wrote, and her letters were honest in the way her letters had always been honest, and they told him, in the gaps between the practical details, more than their actual content said. She was exhausted. She was doing the work of 3 people and being paid and credited for the work of 1, which was not a new situation for her but was a harder one than usual. She had fired Thomas's business contact, who turned out to be quietly redirecting print contracts to a competitor, and had handled the confrontation in a way that she described briefly and without drama, but that Silas could tell, reading between her lines, had been significant and probably unpleasant. She was capable. That was the thing that kept resolving itself in his mind, not as a discovery. He'd known it from the beginning, but as a deepening certainty. She was capable in the specific way that frontier life required, not the genteel competence of a well-organized household, but the harder, rougher competence of someone who understood that systems failed and plans changed, and that what you needed when that happened was not a plan, but a person. He wrote to her about the winter, about the storm that came down from Canada in January and buried the fence line in 4 hours and required 2 solid days of digging out, about the cow he'd lost to the cold, not sentimentally, because cattle were cattle and you didn't survive the frontier by being sentimental about cattle, but with the matter-of-fact acknowledgement that it was a loss and losses were part of the ledger. About the way the prairie looked in the deep, cold, blue-white, and absolutely still in the evenings, beautiful in a way that had nothing soft about it. He told her things he hadn't told anyone, not because he was a private man. He was genuinely a private man, but because he'd discovered, over the months of their correspondence, that telling her things made him understand them differently, made him see them more clearly, the way a thing seen twice from different angles becomes more dimensional than a thing seen only once. Spring came. Her father's condition stabilized. The print shop numbers improved. Thomas reappeared, contrite and temporarily useful. Summer again and a second winter. And into the third year, slowly and almost without either of them remarking on it, the distance between what was and what was supposed to be began to close. The letter that changed everything arrived in February of 1886, nearly 2 years after the first letter about her father's stroke. It was shorter than most of her letters, and more careful, which was how Silas had learned to recognize when she was writing about something that mattered. She told him that her father had recovered enough, not to what he'd been, that wasn't possible, but to a functional stability that allowed for planning, that she had spent the last 3 months training a man named Garrett, a capable press operator she'd promoted to floor supervisor, to handle the operation she currently managed, that she had arranged the finances so that her father's income would be protected regardless of her presence, that Thomas had, finally, and apparently genuinely, stepped into a role that he was performing adequately, if not brilliantly. She told him that she had a question she needed to ask, and that she wanted an honest answer. Was the chair still there? Silas read the letter standing at the kitchen table with his coat still on from the morning's work. Outside, the February wind was moving across the prairie with the low, indifferent persistence that characterized Montana winters, and the light was the thin white light of a cold, clear day. He sat down and wrote back immediately, which was unusual for him. He almost never wrote immediately, almost always waited the day or two it took for his thoughts to settle into something he trusted. But there was nothing to settle here. There was nothing to think through. He wrote 4 sentences. The chair is still there. It has not moved. I will be at the Harlow station on whatever day you arrive if you send me the train schedule. Take whatever time you need with your father before you go. He sent the letter that same afternoon. Her reply came 3 weeks later with a single detail: the date and time of her arrival. No flourishes. No long explanation of what she was feeling, just the practical information, delivered in the handwriting he'd come to know as well as his own. Silas read it, folded it, and set it on the kitchen table. He sat for a while in the quiet of the house. Then he got up and went outside to check on the second chair, which was still there, slightly darkened by 2 Montana winters but solid as it had ever been, angled toward the left chair the way it had always been angled, facing the same stretch of prairie they'd faced together when she finally arrived. He straightened it slightly. Then he went back to work. The morning of March 12th, 1886, was cold and clear. The sky a particular shade of blue that existed at high altitude in early spring, not soft, not warm, but achingly transparent, as if the air itself had been purified by the cold to something close to pure. Silas had been at the Harlow station since 8 in the morning. The train wasn't due until noon. He stood on the platform in the clothes he'd worn to town on important occasions. His better coat, his boots cleaned the previous evening, and tried to look like a man who was simply waiting for a train rather than a man who was standing at the absolute edge of something he'd been moving toward for 3 years. Dutch Holloway had offered to come. Silas had declined, which Dutch accepted with poor grace and a parting shot about stubbornness that was pot and kettle enough that both of them knew it. He watched the platform fill with people and drain of them. A family with too much luggage and a crying infant. A cattleman with a shipping manifest he kept frowning at. 2 young men who looked like they'd just arrived from somewhere back east and hadn't yet realized what they'd arrived into. The noon whistle came from a distance. The train materialized from the east as trains always materialized on the frontier, so first as a sound, then as a smear of dark smoke against the sky, then as something solid and large and real coming toward you faster than it looked from a distance. It stopped. Steam exhaled in long white clouds. People moved. He watched the doors. He had no idea what she looked like. Her letters had been so precise in their practical self-description: height, hair color, eye color, hands, that he felt he had a reasonable mental image. But mental images were approximations at best, and he was aware that they were often wrong in the particular ways that mattered. She was not the first person off the train, or the second, or the third. She was one of a cluster of passengers who came down together about 4 minutes after the train stopped, and he identified her. He later couldn't explain with any precision how, before he'd consciously processed any of the specific details. It was something about the way she moved, not graceful, not dramatic, but purposeful. She came down the steps looking at the platform rather than looking for someone, getting her bearings first, and that single detail, the instinct to understand the space before looking for the person, told him something he'd already known from her letters. She had a single large trunk and a leather satchel over one shoulder, and she wore a dark blue coat that had seen hard use and had not been replaced because hard use was not, apparently, a sufficient reason to replace a functional coat. Her hair was dark, pulled back practically. Her eyes, when she finally turned and found him in the small crowd, were dark as well, and more serious than her letters had prepared him for, and also somehow exactly right. They looked at each other across 10 feet of platform. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said, "Is the second chair still there?" And Silas Rowan, who was not a man of many words and had always believed that the right words were more important than many words, nodded once. Margaret Ellison, who would be Margaret Rowan by April, in a brief ceremony with no more guests than the occasion required, looked at him for another moment. She was doing what she always did, he would come to understand. Not performing a feeling, but actually experiencing it, letting it register completely before she decided what to do with it. What she did with it eventually was pick up her leather satchel and walk toward him. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him with those serious dark eyes. "I should tell you," she said, "that I'm still a poor cook." "I know," he said. "You told me. And I have opinions." "I know. Strong ones on quite a lot of subjects." "I know that too." Something shifted slightly at the corner of her mouth. It was not exactly a smile. It was something smaller and more specific than a smile. Something that said she'd assessed the situation and found it acceptable. "All right," she said. He picked up one end of her trunk. She kept the other end because she didn't automatically release things she was capable of carrying herself, and he didn't ask her to because he already knew her well enough not to. They walked together to the wagon. Behind them, the train exhaled another long breath of steam and began, slowly and with great mechanical authority, to move on. The wagon ride back to the ranch took the better part of 3 hours, and it was not comfortable. The road, if you were generous enough to call it a road, which Margaret privately was not, was a rutted track that the spring thaw had turned into something closer to a series of connected obstacles, and the wagon had a left rear wheel that made a sound on every rotation that suggested it was considering a more permanent protest. Silas drove without apparent concern for either the road or the wheel, which Margaret took to mean that this was simply the normal condition of both. She didn't complain. She watched the landscape instead, which was doing what landscapes do when they're trying to make an impression. The afternoon light had gone gold and low, the kind of light that makes even ordinary things look significant, and the prairie stretched out in every direction with a scale that was genuinely difficult to absorb after years of living inside a city's compressed geography. She'd known, intellectually, that Montana was large. Knowing it intellectually and sitting in a wagon watching it prove itself were two different experiences. "How much further?" she asked, not because she needed to stop, but because the silence had reached a length that she felt required some acknowledgement. "Hour and a half," Silas said. "Maybe less if the creek's still passable." "Is there a reason it might not be? Snow came off the mountains fast this year, creek's running high." He glanced at her briefly, not with concern exactly, more with the assessment of a man trying to gauge whether information would be useful or alarming. "We'll see when we get there. And if it's not passable? Then we go around the long way and it's closer to 2 hours." Margaret considered this. "You might have mentioned that at the station. Didn't know you were the kind of person who needs to know things in advance. I'm the kind of person who prefers accurate information to approximate information." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Duly noted," he said. It was, she would think later, a completely unremarkable exchange, practical, faintly pointed on her side, accepting on his, and yet it was also, in some important sense, the first real conversation they'd ever had. because letters were not conversation, and she'd understood that going in but hadn't fully understood what it would feel like to discover that the person she'd been writing to for 2 years was a person who existed in 3 dimensions and took up space and had a particular way of sitting with his shoulders slightly forward and his jaw set. Not from tension, but from some fundamental character of his physical self that letters couldn't transmit. He was different from what she'd pictured. Not worse, not better. Different in the specific ways that real people are always different from their correspondents. Quieter in person, which seemed impossible given how spare his letters already were, but true. And larger physically than she'd imagined, with hands that showed the kind of sustained work that left permanent evidence, and a face that was weathered in ways that made him look older than 35 until he looked at you directly. And then he looked younger. The creek turned out to be passable, though barely, and they crossed it with the wagon listing alarmingly to the right for about 40 feet before the ground firmed up again. Margaret held the side of the wagon seat and said nothing. Silas drove through it with the same unhurried focus he seemed to apply to everything, and when they came out the other side, he glanced at her with something that might have been a question. "Fine," she said, before he could ask. The ghost of an expression crossed his face. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. They arrived at the ranch as the last of the light was going. The house was not what she'd expected, which was not a criticism. Her expectations had been built from his descriptions, which were accurate but not complete, the way any description of a place is not complete until you're inside it and can feel the specific quality of its air and light. It was small, genuinely small, smaller than her apartment in Chicago, though it sat in the middle of 40 acres, which gave it a spatial relationship to the world around it that an apartment building never could. The porch was exactly as he'd described it. The 2 chairs were there, side by side, angled toward each other, darkened by weather, but solid. She stood in the yard and looked at the second chair for a moment. It was just a chair. That was the thing she hadn't been able to decide. In all those months of letters and waiting and working through her father's ledgers at midnight, whether the chair was just a chair or whether it was something more than that, and now that she was looking at it, she thought the answer was probably both, and that was fine. "The back bedroom still has gaps in the boards," Silas said from behind her. "You mentioned that. I filled most of them, but there's one on the north wall that lets light in the mornings. I haven't gotten to it." She turned around. He was standing at the back of the wagon, not looking at her, pulling her trunk out with the efficient economy of movement she was already starting to recognize as characteristic. She walked over and took her end. "I'll manage it," he said. "I know you can manage it," Margaret said. "I'm taking my end." He looked at her. She looked back. He let her take her end. They carried it inside together. The first week was the hardest, but not in any of the ways she'd anticipated. She'd prepared herself during the long months of decision for the practical difficulties, the physical labor, the unfamiliar rhythms of agricultural life, the sheer logistical complexity of a household that produced most of what it consumed. She'd prepared herself for the cold and the mud and the distances. She'd prepared herself, she realized, for the frontier. What she hadn't prepared for was the intimacy of shared domestic space. In Chicago, she had lived alone for 4 years, in rooms she'd arranged to suit herself, on a schedule she determined, with a silence that belonged entirely to her when she wanted it. The print shop was noisy and demanding, full of other people's voices and machinery and urgency, but she went home from it, and home was hers. That was a thing she hadn't known she'd built a dependency on until she no longer had it. Silas was a quiet man, as she'd known from his letters, but a quiet man in a small house is still a presence. She could hear him moving in the mornings before she was awake, hear the particular sound of the back door that meant he'd gone out to the barn, hear the kettle which he always put on before he did anything else, and which was always done by the time she came out of the bedroom. These were small things, individually meaningless. Collectively, they were the adjustment that no amount of correspondence had prepared her for. On the 4th morning, she came out of the bedroom to find him sitting at the kitchen table with a set of field maps spread out in front of him, a cup of coffee at his elbow, frowning at something in the drainage pattern on the eastern acreage. She recognized the issue immediately. It was the same one she'd raised in the letter 18 months ago, the one he'd initially dismissed and then, apparently, spent the intervening months addressing in stages. "You're still not satisfied with the east field," she said. "Dry season will show whether I fixed it properly." He looked up. "Coffee's on." She poured herself a cup and came to look at the maps over his shoulder. He shifted slightly to give her a better angle, which she took as an invitation. They spent the next 40 minutes going over the drainage problem together, and it was, she noticed this with some surprise, entirely comfortable, easier than it had any right to be. She'd had professional conversations about complex problems with people she'd worked alongside for years that were less productive than this one with a man she'd known in person for 4 days. The fourth day was also when she discovered the kitchen was a problem, not because she couldn't cook. She'd told him plainly in her first letter that she was a functional cook, not a skilled one, and that hadn't changed. The problem was that the kitchen itself was organized with the particular logic of a man who'd spent years alone in it. Everything in places that made sense to him, but required a kind of spatial archaeology to decode. The flour was in a lidded tin on the second shelf from the bottom, which was either below waist height or a specific choice that meant something she couldn't parse. The salt and the sugar were in near identical containers with no markings. The skillet hung on the wall, but the lid for the skillet was in a drawer across the room. She reorganized it on the fifth day without asking, moving things to where they made sense to her, which was not where they'd been. Silas noticed that evening. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, taking in the rearrangement with the expression of a man running a rapid internal inventory. Then he said, "You moved the flour." "To the upper shelf, at a practical height. I kept it low so the moisture wouldn't get to it." Margaret turned from the stove. "Does moisture rise in here?" He thought about it. "The upper shelf should be dry enough," he allowed, "and the salt and sugar should be labeled. I know which is which." "I don't, and it's more practical to label them." He was quiet for a moment, that particular Silas quiet that she'd learned was him thinking rather than him dismissing. "I'll mark them," he said. It was a small thing, but it established something that turned out to be important, that she was not a guest in his house and was not going to organize herself around it as if she were. She was building a home, and building a home meant having an equal claim on the logic of its spaces. He understood this, or came to understand it, faster than she'd expected. Dutch Holloway came by at the end of the first week, ostensibly because he had a question about a fence line they shared on the north boundary, but transparently because he'd been waiting 6 days to get a look at the woman Silas Rowan had kept a chair for 3 years. He rode up to the house mid-morning while Silas was out in the east field and Margaret was on the porch working through a letter to her father that was taking longer than it should have because the right words for explaining what this life looked and felt like kept not being the words she was actually writing down. Dutch pulled up at the fence and looked at her with the frank assessment of a man who didn't bother with pretense about what he was doing. "You'd be Margaret," he said. "I would be," she said. She set down her pen. "Dutch Holloway. I'm the closest neighbor, which in this part of the country means about 4 miles north." He paused, still looking at her with the same evaluating directness. "You're shorter than I expected." "Then you expected based on what?" Margaret asked. "Something Silas said once." "Silas has never seen me. He didn't know how tall I was." Dutch appeared to consider this. "Then I must have made it up," he said, without any obvious embarrassment at the logic of this. "You settled in all right?" "We're getting there." "Kitchen's been reorganized, Silas told me." Margaret looked at him. "He told you that?" "He mentioned it, in the same tone he mentions when a fence post needs resetting, like it's a thing that happened and he's still figuring out what he thinks about it." Dutch squinted at her. "He doesn't complain in case you haven't figured that out yet." "I'd noticed. What you hear instead is him describing the situation. Then a day or two later, he does whatever the situation requires." Dutch nodded slowly, apparently having assessed her sufficiently to reach some conclusion. "He's been waiting a long time for somebody to argue with," he added. "The rest of us gave up." Silas appeared from the direction of the east field before she could answer that, and Dutch turned to him with the smooth transition of a man who'd said exactly what he'd come to say and was now done with it. The week settled into something that was not yet routine, but was moving toward it. Margaret planted a kitchen garden in the patch of ground south of the house, less from any particular expertise in gardening than from a conviction that they shouldn't be purchasing vegetables they could grow, and she attacked the project with the same systematic thoroughness she'd applied to the print shop floor, researching which crops could handle Montana's short growing season, mapping the planting schedule against the last frost date, building a simple composting arrangement that Silas looked at with mild skepticism and eventually admitted in late summer was working better than expected. The financial records she found in a tin box under the kitchen table were the ones that truly alarmed her. They weren't wrong, exactly. They were accurate in the way that records kept by a man who understands his operation but doesn't trust the record keeping are accurate. Enough to give you the big picture without the detail that makes decision-making possible. Income was tracked in rough columns by season. Expenses were noted when Silas remembered to note them. There was no record of depreciation on equipment, no projection of future costs against future likely income. Nothing that would allow you to look at a coming year with any real understanding of where the risks were. She brought it up carefully, which for her meant she thought about how to say it for a full day before saying it, not softening the substance, but at least considering the construction. "Your records are insufficient," she told him one evening after supper, with the tin box on the table between them. He looked at the box and then at her. "I know what I spend and what I earn. Generally, yes. Specifically, no." She opened the box and spread the papers out. "You don't have a clear picture of where the operation is losing efficiency. You don't know your per-acre yield costs. You don't know when your equipment is going to need replacing because you've never tracked its working hours." She looked up. "These aren't criticisms of how you've run things. You've done this alone, and alone this level of tracking probably worked. But if the operation is going to grow, it needs better information." Silas looked at the papers for a long moment. "I know it's not as organized as it should be," he said. "It's not organized at all. It's a record of things that happened with no framework for using that record to make decisions." She paused, because she wanted to be fair. "The farming itself is sound. The practices you've developed for this specific soil and climate are genuinely good. The underlying operation is stronger than these records suggest, but you're managing it by instinct, and instinct has limits." He was quiet for a while. The lamp on the table threw a warm, unsteady light that made the silence feel softer than it might have otherwise, though not entirely soft. "My father managed his farm by instinct," he said finally, "for 20 years. And then he lost it," Margaret said. Not unkindly, but directly. It landed. She watched it land. His jaw tightened slightly in a way she recognized from her own face sometimes, the physical response to a truth that you'd been avoiding looking at directly. She didn't say anything else because she didn't need to. He was a man who heard what was said and thought about it properly, and adding more would only give him something additional to push back on rather than something true to sit with. "What would you need to set up what you're describing?" he asked after a moment. "Time and a decent ledger book. The time is mine. You'll need to tell me numbers I don't have yet. Input costs, day labor when you've used it, equipment costs going back as far as you can remember." She paused. "It'll take a few weeks to build out properly, and you'll need to answer a lot of questions." "I don't love answering questions." "I know. You'll do it anyway." Something in his face settled. Not agreement, exactly. More like the recognition that the argument was over and the work was beginning, which for Silas Rowan were essentially the same thing. They built the ledger system together over the course of 3 weeks, Silas providing numbers and dates, and Margaret organizing them into a structure that could be read and used and projected forward. It was, in its way, one of the most revealing processes she'd ever undergone, because building a financial record of a farming operation from the ground up required understanding not just the numbers but the land itself, how it behaved seasonally, where it was strong and where it needed attention, which investments had returned value, and which had been a form of educated hope that hadn't paid out. She asked a great many questions. He answered them, sometimes impatiently, occasionally incorrectly, and then correcting himself, always eventually accurately. By the end of 3 weeks, she understood the ranch in a way she couldn't have from any amount of correspondence. The drought came in their second August together, and it came hard. It announced itself the way Montana disasters usually did, with a deceptive period of merely dry weather that seemed manageable, that most people in the area were calling a dry patch, a temporary thing, not anything to restructure your plans around. By the third week of August, the creek was lower than it had been even in Silas's driest previous summer. By the fourth week, the eastern fields' crops were visibly stressed despite the irrigation work he'd done, and the neighbors were gathering at Dutch Holloway's place on Sunday afternoons with the specific grim sociability of people comparing how badly things were going. Margaret went to one of these gatherings and came back changed, not visibly changed. She didn't dramatically announce a new plan or make any declarations. She simply came back quieter than usual, which was notable because she was not generally a quiet woman, and she went to the desk in the bedroom and sat there for an hour with paper and pen, and when she came out, she had a list. "What's that?" Silas asked. "7 families in the area have books they're not using," she said. 3 have specialized knowledge that would be useful to others. The Halverson woman knows salt-curing preservation methods that would extend anyone's food stores significantly. Old Bauer knows winter wheat varieties that do better in low moisture conditions. The Prentice family has a mechanical aptitude that's going to waste because nobody's organized a way to share it. Silas looked at the list. And we're all trying to survive individually, Margaret said. When the drought hits one operation hard, that operation fails. When it hits the whole territory and everyone's trying to solve the same problem separately, the failure rate multiplies. She set the list on the table. But if people were sharing what they know, sharing resources during the hardest parts of the season, building something that functions more like a community than a collection of individual operations. People out here are independent, Silas said. They don't take easily to organized arrangements. I know that. I'm not talking about organized arrangements. I'm talking about sharing books and knowledge and practical skills. She looked at him. People will accept help if it doesn't feel like charity and doesn't require them to give up anything they value. What they value is their independence and their expertise. So you acknowledge the expertise publicly, you invite Mrs. Halverson not to receive help, but to give it, to share what she knows. That's different. He looked at the list for a long moment. You've been thinking about this since the gathering. I've been thinking about this since the first month we were here, and I noticed that every family within 20 miles was solving the same problems entirely separately. She paused. The drought just made it urgent. He was quiet. You want to do this from our house. It makes sense. We're central. We have the space. And we have... She gestured at the shelves that had accumulated over a year and a half of her deliberate effort. Books ordered from Chicago and from a Denver supplier, practical reference volumes on agriculture and medicine and mechanics. Something worth sharing. Silas looked at the shelves. He looked at the list. He looked at his wife, who was watching him with the particular patience she deployed when she was certain about something and was waiting for him to catch up. It'll make more work, he said. Yes. People will come here and expect things from us during seasons when we don't have extra to give. Some of them will, and some of them will bring things we need instead. She picked up the list. I'd rather be the kind of household that gave things during a drought and ran short than the kind that kept everything and watched neighbors fail. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the August wind moved across the dry grass with a sound like paper. The drought was real, and it was not over, and both of them knew it. Start with Mrs. Halverson, he said finally. She's the most practical place to begin, and she and Dutch have a history that might complicate things if you don't handle the approach carefully. Margaret looked at him. What kind of history? The 40-year kind. I'll explain later. She almost smiled. All right. She started with Mrs. Halverson that same week, riding out to the widow's property on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 jars of preserved plums she'd put up in June as an opening gift and a straightforward explanation of what she was trying to build. The widow, a compact, sharp-eyed Scandinavian woman in her 60s who had outlasted 2 Montana winters alone since her husband died, and had opinions about most things she was willing to state at length, listened to Margaret's proposal with the expression of someone trying to decide whether they were being patronized. You want me to teach people what I know, she said. I want you to share what you know, yes, because it's more useful in other people's hands than it is kept to yourself. And I think you know that. There was a pause. What do you get out of this? A community that survives the drought better than it would otherwise, Margaret said, which means neighbors who are still here and still functional next year, which is good for everyone, including us. Mrs. Halverson looked at her for a long moment with those sharp eyes. Your husband told me you were direct, she said. What else did he say? That you'd been running a print operation in Chicago and you had opinions about record keeping. That's accurate. He said it like it was a compliment. Mrs. Halverson paused. He's not a man who hands those out carelessly. No, Margaret said, he's not. The older woman set down her coffee cup and was quiet for a moment in the way of someone making a decision they've already mostly made. I'll come Thursday, she said. If you can get the Bauer family there as well. August Bauer's winter wheat varieties are the piece of information this community needs more than anything else I can provide, and I won't come and talk to an empty room. Thursday, Margaret said. I'll have the Bauers there. She rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon with the dry wind at her back and the drought-pale prairies stretching out around her. And for the first time since the hard, dry weeks had begun, she felt something that wasn't anxiety about what the coming months would cost them. It wasn't certainty. She knew better than to confuse action with certainty, knew that Thursday might go badly, that August Bauer might decline, that the whole thing might produce nothing useful before the season broke. But it was something. It was movement in a direction she believed in, which in her experience was the closest thing to certainty that honest living allowed. She unsaddled the horse at the barn and found Silas coming in from the field at the same moment, his shirt dark with sweat and his boots carrying the red clay dust of the east acreage. He looked at her face and read something there. She said yes, he asked. Thursday. She wants the Bauers there too. He nodded once. Then, after a moment, I'll ride to the Bauer place tomorrow morning. She looked at him. You don't have to do that. I can go. August Bauer will take it better from me first, Silas said. I'll explain what you're building. Then you can talk to him Thursday, and he'll already understand what's being asked. He paused. It's not about your ability to handle him. It's about sequence. This, she understood, was Silas at his most useful. Not stepping in front of her, but thinking through the practical structure of a problem and putting himself where he'd do the most good, without any particular drama about it. It was the thing she'd come to rely on in the year and a half they'd been building this life together, and it still surprised her sometimes, the specific shape of it. He was not an easy man in most ways. He was inflexible about certain things, stubborn in the way that came from having figured things out alone and trusted his own judgment for too long. He still reorganized the shed the way he wanted it after she'd arranged it differently, and he still drove the wagon too fast on the creek crossing, and he still had a way of going entirely silent for hours at a time in the evenings that had startled her at first, and that she'd slowly learned to read as not withdrawal, but simply him. But he was, in the ways that mattered, a man who showed up, who did the work without being asked, who moved to where he was needed without requiring acknowledgement for having moved, who understood, without her having to explain it to him in language he might resist, that what she was building with Mrs. Halverson and August Bauer and the gathering families of Calhoun Flats was not separate from what they were building together on this 40 acres. It was the same project. It had always been the same project. She went inside and began writing the letter to her father, the one she'd been trying to write since she arrived, the one that kept failing because she didn't have the right words. She still wasn't sure she had the right words, but she had, at least, the right life to write about. Outside, the drought continued, patient and indifferent, doing what droughts do. Inside, the lamp burned on the kitchen table, and the ledger sat open to the current month, and the two rocking chairs waited on the porch in the dark, facing the same direction they always faced, toward the grass and the sky and the long unfinished horizon of everything that still needed doing. The Thursday gathering happened the way most important things happened on the frontier. Imperfectly, with complications that hadn't been anticipated, and with an outcome that was better than it had any right to be given the circumstances. August Bauer arrived 40 minutes late because one of his draft horses had thrown a shoe that morning, and he came in with the particular irritability of a man who'd had a bad start to his day and hadn't entirely recovered from it. He was a large man, late 50s, German-born like Becker, the woodworker in Harlow, but with none of Becker's quiet precision. Bauer was loud in the way that people who've spent decades trying to make themselves heard over machinery and weather are loud, not from rudeness, but from simple calibration. He looked at the assembled people in Silas and Margaret's front room, Mrs. Halverson, the Prentice family, two young homesteader couples from the eastern edge of the flats, and a taciturn sheep farmer named Cord, who spoke rarely but listened with the focused attention of a man cataloging everything for later use. And he looked at Margaret and said, without preamble, "Your husband tells me you want me to talk about winter wheat. I want you to share what you know about varieties that perform better in low moisture conditions," Margaret said. "Yes." "Why should I do that?" It was a fair question, and she'd expected it, or something like it. Because the drought is hurting everyone in this room, and knowledge about drought-resistant planning is the most practical thing anyone here could contribute to changing that. She paused. And because the information doesn't cost you anything to share. It doesn't become less valuable in your hands because other people have it too. Bauer looked at her for a moment. He was the kind of man who decided things quickly but didn't show the decision immediately, as a matter of principle. Sit down, he told her, which was technically backwards given that it was her house. And then he pulled out a chair and sat down himself and began talking about winter wheat in the specific practical terms of a man who'd spent 30 years learning it from the ground up. The gathering ran 4 hours. Mrs. Halverson's salt-curing demonstration extended well past the time Margaret had allocated for it, because the prentice woman had questions that led to other questions, and because it turned out that what Mrs. Halverson knew about long-term food preservation extended well beyond salt curing into smoking and dry packing and a half dozen other techniques that the younger families in the room had never encountered. The 2 younger homesteader couples, the Garfields and the Wades, both in their mid-20s, both clearly struggling in ways they were trying not to show, sat through the whole thing with the intensity of people absorbing information they genuinely needed. Silas mostly stayed out of it. He made 2 pots of coffee and fixed the Bowers wagon tongue that had cracked on the road in, and at one point Margaret looked out the window and saw him and Cord, the sheep farmer, leaning against the fence, having what appeared to be a separate and entirely technical conversation about pasture rotation. She let it go. He was doing what he did, finding the place where he was useful and occupying it without announcement. When the last people left in the early evening, the house was quieter than it had been in weeks, and Margaret sat down at the kitchen table and felt the specific tiredness of a thing having been done that had taken effort to set in motion. It was a good tired, mostly, but it was still tired. Silas came in from seeing the Bowers off and looked at her. "Well," he said. "Well," she considered. "The Garfield woman cried during the food preservation section. I don't think she expected to. I think she didn't realize until Mrs. Halverson started talking how close they were to being genuinely short on food this winter." Silas was quiet. "We should have done this earlier," Margaret said, "before the drought, before anyone was close to short." "You hadn't arrived before the drought," he said. She looked at him. "That's not the point." "I know it's not the point." He sat down across from her. "The point is whether it's worth continuing, whether this becomes a regular thing. Monthly," she said, "at minimum. And we need a book-sharing arrangement, not lending, which creates obligations people resent when they can't return things on time, but a genuine exchange. People bring what they have, take what they need, and the circulation works itself out." She looked at the shelves. "We'll need more books. I'm going to write to the Chicago supplier. Books cost money." "Yes, they do." She met his eyes. "It's a good use of money." He didn't argue. This was one of the things she'd come to understand about him. He picked his arguments carefully, which meant that when he did push back on something, it was worth paying attention to because he wasn't doing it reflexively. He was doing it because he'd considered and concluded that the pushback was warranted. "Order what you think we need," he said. Outside, the drought went on. But the evenings on the Rowan porch acquired a different quality after that Thursday. Sometimes Dutch Holloway came by after supper, and sometimes the Garfields stopped in on their way back from somewhere. And occasionally Mrs. Halverson appeared unannounced with a dish she claimed was surplus, but that Margaret suspected was generosity wearing the disguise of practicality. The second rocking chair was moved inside for the winter, its twin right beside it, and the kitchen table became the real center of the house. The place where ledgers were spread and books were lent, and the difficult arithmetic of frontier survival was worked through in company rather than alone. It was at the kitchen table, in November of their second year together, that the argument happened. Not the first argument they'd had. They'd argued before, over practical things mostly, with the specific friction of 2 people whose instincts had been formed independently and didn't always align. But this was the first real argument, the kind with weight behind it. The kind that stayed in the room after it ended. It started over the Garfield family. Young Thomas Garfield had come to Silas privately the week before, asking about the possibility of borrowing money to get his operation through the winter. It wasn't an outrageous amount, enough to cover feed costs and a repair to the roof of his storage building that couldn't wait for spring. Silas had told him he'd think about it and sent him home, and then hadn't told Margaret about the conversation for 4 days, which was the part that became the problem. "He asked you 4 days ago," Margaret said, when it finally came out. not as an accusation, but in the flat tone she used when she was working to stay level and finding it effortful. I was thinking about it. 4 days is a long time to think about something this straightforward. Either we have the money and it's the right thing to do, or we don't, and it isn't. She looked at him across the table. Do we have the money? We have it. Then what were you thinking about for 4 days? He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding how honest to be, which was its own kind of answer. Whether lending money to neighbors is the kind of thing that ends up destroying the relationship, he said. I've seen it. You lend money to a man who needs it, and when he can't pay it back the way he planned, every time he sees you, he sees the debt, and the friendship calcifies around it. That's a real risk, Margaret said, and it would have been useful information to discuss 4 days ago, which is why I needed to know about the conversation 4 days ago. I wasn't keeping it from you. You didn't tell me for 4 days. That's not the same as keeping it from you. Silas. She said his name with the particular quality of someone requiring precision. We agreed from the beginning that this operation, all of it, the money and the land decisions and the community relationships, we agreed that those were shared, that I wasn't here to manage the kitchen and you weren't here to manage everything else. That was the agreement. I know what the agreement was. Then tell me when Thomas Garfield asks to borrow money, not 4 days later, not after you've spent 4 days deciding by yourself what you think about it and presenting me with a conclusion. He looked at her and she could see that she'd landed somewhere real, somewhere that required him to sit with the truth of it rather than defend against it. His jaw was set in that way it got, but his eyes were doing something different. The look of a man running an honest internal inventory rather than preparing a counter-argument. You're right, he said. It came out roughly, without ornament. I know. She let it sit for a moment. The solution to your concern about lending to neighbors, by the way, is not to offer it as a loan. He looked at her. What does that mean? It means if we help the Garfields through the winter, we do it as neighbors doing what neighbors do, not as a financial transaction with terms and a repayment schedule. We don't track it. We don't call it a loan. We help them, and in 2 years when we need something, they help us, and nobody keeps score. She paused. The debt you're worried about comes from making it formal. If it stays informal, it stays human. Silas was quiet for a long time. That's a different way of thinking about it than I was using, he said. I know. That's why you should have told me 4 days ago. Something shifted in his face that she would have called, if she were being honest with herself, relief. The particular relief of a man who'd been carrying a problem alone and has just been relieved of some of the weight of it, not because the problem is solved, but because there's someone to carry it alongside. I'll ride to the Garfields tomorrow, he said. We'll ride to the Garfields tomorrow, Margaret said, together. They rode out the next morning in the cold November air, and the conversation with Thomas Garfield and his wife took less than an hour, and Margaret handled most of it because Silas had been right about one thing. August Bauer and the book-sharing gatherings and the slow accumulation of the community's trust had largely been built on her initiative, and that initiative carried a particular kind of authority with the younger families that Silas's quieter presence didn't quite replicate in the same way. She was direct with them, as she was with everyone, and she made it clear that what they were offering was not charity and not a loan, but simply what you did for people you intended to remain neighbors with for the rest of your life. Mrs. Garfield, who was 23 and more capable than the situation she was currently in, suggested, looked at Margaret with an expression that was complicated in the specific way that the expressions of people who need help but hate needing it are complicated, and said, "We'll pay it back." "I know you will," Margaret said, which was the only answer that let the other woman keep her dignity, and which also happened to be true. The winter that year was the hardest one yet. It came early and stayed long and produced the kind of cold that Silas's Kansas childhood had not prepared him for despite years of Montana acclimation. Not just the temperature, but the duration of it, week after week of below-zero nights that tested every structural decision he'd made in the construction of the outbuildings and found 3 of them wanting. A section of the barn roof failed in January under the weight of accumulated ice, and they spent 2 days in bitter cold making emergency repairs with lumber from the woodpile that had been intended for other purposes. Silas on the roof and Margaret below passing boards up and holding the rope line that kept the patch section in tension until the joint could be properly nailed. It was during those 2 days that she understood something about him that letters hadn't conveyed, and even the previous year and a half of marriage hadn't quite made concrete. In a crisis, Silas Rowan became almost completely still inside himself. Not cold, not removed or detached, but still, in the way that water goes still in a deep place. The urgency of the situation didn't accelerate him into recklessness the way it accelerated some people. It slowed him down to the speed at which things could be done correctly, and he worked at that speed and no other, regardless of what the weather or the circumstances were asking for. She found this during those 2 cold days on and below the failing barn roof unreasonably steadying. On the second day, when the temporary repair was holding and they were down off the roof and warming themselves by the stove with bad coffee and aching hands, she said, "You're good in a crisis." "The roof's still going to need proper work in the spring," he said. "I know. I said you're good in a crisis. I didn't say the crisis was over." He looked at her over his coffee cup. There was frost still in his beard that hadn't entirely melted. "You're not bad in a crisis yourself," he said. "You held that rope line for 6 hours without complaining." "I complained internally." "I know. I could tell." A pause. "You did it anyway." She looked at her hands, which were chapped raw from the cold and the rope work. "I wasn't going to let go," she said. "It would have been the wrong time to let go." He was quiet, and then he said something that was, for Silas, approximately a speech. "I know you had other options in Chicago, things that would have been easier than this." He set down his coffee cup. "I don't think I've ever said directly that I'm aware of that." She looked at him. "Are you telling me you're grateful?" "I'm telling you I know what it cost." "It didn't cost me things I wanted to keep," she said. "That's different." She paused, being as precise as she could be, because she owed him precision on this. "I didn't leave Chicago because I was unhappy there, or because I had nothing. I left because what I was building here was more important than what I was continuing there. That's not sacrifice. That's a choice." He looked at her for a moment with those direct eyes of his. "Most people don't know the difference," he said. "Most people haven't thought about it long enough." She picked up her coffee. "I had 2 years of correspondence to think about it. I had sufficient time." The spring after the hard winter brought something none of them had been expecting, a land dispute. It came from a direction that caught them all off guard. Not from a bank or a large cattle operation, the 2 usual suspects in frontier land conflicts, but from a man named Aldous Crane, who arrived in Calhoun Flats in April, driving a good buggy and carrying documentation suggesting that his late uncle had held a prior claim on approximately 12 acres of the eastern boundary of Silas's property, a claim that had lapsed administratively during a period of territorial reorganization, but which Crane, with the assistance of a lawyer in Helena, was now attempting to resurrect. The 12 acres in question were not, in isolation, catastrophic. They were the eastern edge of the field, the part that had given the most drainage trouble, the part that had required the most work. But they sat between the main acreage and the creek access that Silas used for irrigation, and losing them would mean losing reliable water in dry seasons, which made them, functionally, worth far more than their acreage suggested. Crane came to the house on a Tuesday in April, and Silas let him in with the contained courtesy of a man who was already suspicious and was managing that suspicion carefully. Crane was perhaps 50, well-dressed in the manner of a man who wanted you to know he could afford to be, with a quality of smoothness about him that Margaret associated with a certain kind of Chicago businessman, the kind who had learned that presentation was its own form of argument. "I want to be straightforward with you, Mr. Rowan," Crane said, which in Margaret's experience was what people said immediately before being the opposite of straightforward. "This claim is legally sound. My attorney has been very thorough, but I'm a reasonable man and I have no desire to be at legal odds with a neighbor." "We're not neighbors," Silas said. "You don't own land here." "Not yet," Crane said pleasantly, "which is why I'm here to discuss a resolution rather than simply proceeding through the courts." "What kind of resolution?" Margaret asked. Crane looked at her with the slight recalibration of a man who hadn't expected to be addressed by the wife. "A financial settlement," he said, "for the value of the claim, plus some reasonable additional sum for the inconvenience of the process. It would be considerably less expensive than a legal proceeding, I assure you." "How much?" Silas said. Crane named a figure that was, in Margaret's rapid calculation, approximately twice what the land itself was worth by any fair assessment, and about 3 times what they had liquid at that moment. The room was quiet. "I'd like to see the documentation," Margaret said. Crane hesitated, then produced a folder from his case. She took it and went through it at the kitchen table with the same methodical attention she'd applied to her father's business ledgers, while Crane sat across from Silas and they engaged in the particular silence of two men who were not going to make small talk under the circumstances. She read slowly, because the language was the kind that was designed to seem more definitive than it was, and she wanted to be sure she was understanding what it actually said rather than what it was meant to appear to say. When she finished, she set it down. The original claim, she said, was filed in 1871 by a man named Harold Crane. Is that your uncle? It is, Crane said. The claim lapsed in 1876 when the territorial reorganization required refiling within a 60-day window. Your uncle did not refile. Due to illness, Crane said, which our attorney argues constitutes grounds for, I know what it argues, Margaret said. The question is whether a territorial court agrees, and the answer to that question is not as certain as your attorney's presentation of this documentation suggests. She looked at Crane steadily. If you proceed through the courts, this will take years and cost you considerably more than a resolution at the figure you've named, and your probability of success is, at best, uncertain. Crane looked at her with the expression of a man reassessing a situation he'd thought he had well in hand. You have legal expertise, Mrs. Rowan. I have the ability to read a document and understand what it says and what it doesn't say, Margaret said, which is sufficient for this document. Silas said nothing. He was watching Crane with the patient, measuring look that Margaret had come to understand meant he was letting her handle something and was simply making sure it stayed handleable. My offer stands, Crane said, though with slightly less certainty than before. I appreciate that, Margaret said. We'll need 2 weeks to consult with an attorney of our own before we respond. I assume that's reasonable. It was reasonable, and Crane agreed to it, and left with somewhat less of the smoothness he'd arrived with. After the buggy disappeared down the track, Silas was quiet for a moment. Can we win this? He asked. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. Margaret set the folder on the table, but the documentation is weaker than he presented it, and the cost of pursuing it through the courts would be significant for him too. And he's not a local man, which means every month this drags on costs him in time and travel as well as money. You think he'll settle for less? I think he came here expecting to frighten a farmer into paying whatever he asked, and he discovered that we're going to make it complicated for him. She looked at Silas. We need to write to a Helena attorney this week. That costs money. Less than what he's asking. He nodded. Then, after a moment, you read that document very fast. I've been reading legal and commercial documents for 12 years, she said. I'm familiar with the construction. A pause. I've been thinking, he said, with the particular tone that meant what followed had been assembled carefully, that the operation is significantly better managed than it was 2 years ago. I know, she said. I'm saying that's because of you. The records, the community arrangement, the gathering, how we handled the Garfields. He stopped. I'm not comfortable with flowery language. You know that. I know that, she said. I'm saying this is better than it would have been. The ranch, the whole thing. She looked at him across the kitchen table, at his weathered face and his careful eyes, and his permanent inability to say the easy version of things, only the true version. And she felt something that was not a grand dramatic emotion, but was something quieter and more durable than that. The particular feeling of a life that was on balance, the right life. Being lived with the right person in the right place, which was not a feeling she'd been certain she'd ever have, and which she was not inclined to make smaller by being overly demonstrative about it. Go write the letter to the Helena attorney, she said. You write it better than I do. I know. Go get the paper and I'll dictate it. He got the paper. She dictated it. The letter was clear and specific and laid out the situation without either panic or overconfidence, which was, in the end, the only posture worth taking toward a problem that couldn't yet be resolved. You looked at it honestly, you took the action available to you, and you waited for the shape of it to become clearer. Outside, April was doing what April did in Montana, attempting spring in the face of a winter that hadn't entirely agreed to leave. The grass coming up pale and tentative through the last gray patches of snow, the creek running high and fast with the melt. The east field, the disputed 12 acres at its boundary, was just beginning to show the green of the cover crop Silas had planted in the fall. It looked, from the kitchen window, like every other acre of that field. It didn't look like something worth fighting over, but it was. And they would. That was the thing about this life, Margaret thought, watching the field through the glass while the letter dried on the table behind her. You built something, and then you defended it, and then you built some more. There was no plateau, no point at which the work of maintaining what you had became easier than the work of building it in the first place. The frontier didn't offer that. It offered the work, and the land, and the weather, and the neighbors, and the disputes and the hard winters. And in return it offered, if you were lucky and stubborn and willing to be honest about what you didn't know, a life with genuine weight to it, a life that was the sum of actual choices rather than the accumulation of things that had simply happened to you. She turned back from the window. Silas was still sitting at the table, his big worn hands flat on the surface, watching her with those careful eyes. "The letter's dry," he said. "I know." She came back to the table and picked it up. "We'll send it with the morning rider." The land dispute was not resolved that spring. It would stretch into the following summer, requiring 2 trips to Helena and a deposition and a period of genuine uncertainty during which neither of them spoke about it more than necessary, because speaking about it more than necessary wouldn't change anything and would only distribute the anxiety of it further into the texture of their daily life than it needed to go. What would happen? Would happen. In the meantime, the cover crop needed tending, and the ledger needed updating, and the June gathering, the 4th one now, larger than the first 3 and starting to acquire the character of a genuine institution rather than an experiment, needed organizing. That was how you did it. You held the difficult thing in one hand and the daily work in the other, and you kept moving, because the alternative to moving was standing still, and standing still on the frontier was its own kind of decision. The second rocking chair was back on the porch by late April, both chairs facing the grassland the way they always had, the way they would for every spring that followed. Silas sat in the left one in the evenings sometimes, and Margaret sat in the right one, and they didn't always talk. Sometimes they just sat there in the cooling air and watched the light move off the prairie and listened to the wind, which in Montana was always saying something even when you couldn't tell exactly what. It was enough. Most evenings, it was more than enough. The land dispute with Aldous Crane was settled in August of 1888, 2 summers after he'd driven his good buggy up their road with his folder of carefully assembled documentation and his practiced air of reasonable inevitability. The territorial court ruled against him on the grounds that the administrative lapse in 1876 had not been adequately excused by the illness claim, a decision that their Helena attorney communicated in a letter that arrived on a Wednesday morning while Silas was mending the north fence line and Margaret was in the middle of updating the quarterly ledger. She read the letter twice, set it on the table, and went out to find him. He was 3/4 of a mile up the fence line, working a loose post back into solid ground with the focused patience he brought to all physical problems. She walked out to him across the field and handed him the letter without preamble. He read it, standing there in the August heat with the post driver in one hand and the letter in the other, and when he finished, he stood very still for a moment. "It's done," he said. "It's done," Margaret confirmed. He handed the letter back, picked up the post driver, and drove the fence post the remaining 6 inches into the ground with 4 deliberate strokes. Then he set the tool down and looked out across the east field. The disputed 12 acres green and functional in the summer light, the creek visible at its far boundary, moving at the good healthy pace of a wet summer. "I should have trusted the documentation from the beginning," he said, "instead of lying awake about it for 2 years." "You didn't lie awake," Margaret said. "I did. I just didn't tell you I was lying awake." She looked at him. "Next time, tell me." "Next time," he said. He picked up the post driver and moved to the next section of fence, which was his way of indicating that a thing was resolved and he was moving on. And she walked back to the house and the ledger and the very long list of things that still needed doing. The children came in the years that followed, 3 of them, which was exactly what Margaret had privately calculated was the maximum number of children a woman could raise while also running a household operation of increasing complexity without one or the other suffering unacceptably. She did not share this calculation with Silas, who had not formed opinions about the number in advance and simply received each child with the same quality of steady attention he brought to everything, carefully, without drama, learning what each one needed from the ground up. The first was a boy, born in the spring of 1889, whom they named Robert after Margaret's father, who had died the previous winter in Chicago with his business intact and his daughter's name on his lips, according to the letter Thomas sent. She'd cried when the letter arrived, not dramatically, just steadily for about 20 minutes at the kitchen table. And Silas had sat across from her and hadn't said anything useful because there wasn't anything useful to say, which was the correct response, and she appreciated it. Robert the Elder had known about the ranch, had received Margaret's letters about it over the years with what she gathered was a complicated mixture of pride and wistfulness, and had never visited, which was a thing she'd stopped waiting for and eventually made her peace with. Robert the Younger arrived in April and was a loud, determined infant, who became a loud, determined child with his father's stubbornness and his mother's argumentative streak. A combination that Dutch Holloway, who took a grandpaternal interest in the boy, described as a fascinating natural disaster. The second child, a daughter named Clara, not after Margaret's sister, but after a woman in one of the novels she'd ordered from Chicago for reasons she kept to herself, arrived 2 years later, quieter than her brother and with a quality of observant patience that showed up early and stayed. The third, another boy named Edmund, came in the winter of 1893 and was from the beginning the most purely himself of the three, unclassifiable, interested in everything, frightened of nothing, and in possession of a mechanical aptitude that made August Bauer, who'd come to the Rowan gatherings for 7 years by then, announce at one of them that the boy should be apprenticed to an engineer before he took something important apart. He already took the clock apart, Silas said. Did he put it back together? Bauer asked. Mostly. Then he's an engineer, Bauer said with the finality of a man making a diagnosis. The gatherings had by then become something neither Silas nor Margaret had exactly planned for, which was an institution. The monthly meetings at the Rowan House had evolved through a series of organic expansions, more families, more topics, more exchange of books and seeds and techniques, and the kind of practical information that saved operations in bad years, into something that the surrounding community had stopped thinking of as Margaret Rowan's project and started thinking of as simply what happened at the Rowan place, which was, Margaret privately thought, the correct endpoint. The best structures were the ones that became invisible because they'd been thoroughly absorbed. The book collection had grown to fill an entire wall of the front room, supplemented by subscriptions to 3 agricultural journals, 2 general interest papers, and a medical reference volume that the community had collectively purchased after the winter of 1891, when the Prentice family lost their youngest child to a respiratory illness that might, the physician from Harlow said afterward, have been caught earlier with better information. That loss had sharpened something in Margaret about what the gatherings were for. Not just the practical agricultural exchange, as valuable as that was, but the deeper thing underneath it, the thing about people not being alone with problems that other people could help with if they knew the problems existed. It was also in the winter of 1891 that Dutch Holloway's health began to decline in ways he didn't discuss, but that showed themselves in how he rode and how he moved when he came to the house, and in the particular deliberateness with which he lowered himself into a chair. He was in his mid-60s, and had spent those decades entirely outdoors in conditions that the body keeps a running account of, and the account was starting to come due. He didn't complain. He wouldn't have known how. But he started coming to the monthly gatherings more regularly than he had before. And he started staying later, and Margaret noted both things and didn't say anything about them directly because Dutch would not have welcomed directness on this subject. What she did was make sure there was always a particular chair near the stove that nobody else sat in on the nights he came, and that the coffee was always strong the way he liked it, and that whoever was presenting that month addressed themselves occasionally to the corner of the room where Dutch sat, so that he felt included rather than merely present. These were small things. They cost almost nothing. Dutch never acknowledged them, which meant he noticed them. "You're good with people," Silas said to her one evening after a gathering, which for him was approximately the equivalent of a long speech. "I pay attention," she said. "It's not the same thing." For some people it is. She was washing cups and didn't turn around. "Dutch is going to need help this winter. Real help. Not just the gatherings." "I know. Someone should check on him regularly. He won't ask." "I'll write up Tuesday mornings," Silas said. "And Thursdays." She set down the cup she was washing. "I didn't ask you to do that." "I know you didn't." A pause. "He taught me how to read the spring weather when I first came out here. I couldn't tell a Chinook from a false thaw. He rode over and showed me the difference and didn't make me feel stupid for not knowing." Another pause. Longer. "I owe him Tuesdays and Thursdays." She picked the cup back up. "All right," she said. The hardest years were the ones that came in clusters, which the frontier arranged without apparent concern for whether you'd recovered from the previous difficulty before presenting the next one. The drought of 1894 was worse than the one 8 years earlier, a full season of inadequate rain that turned the late summer fields to a pale, crackling nothing and reduced the creek to the thin silver thread Silas remembered from his first solitary years on the land. 4 families in the broader Calhoun Flats area abandoned their operations that summer and left, which was not unusual for a bad drought year but was still a particular kind of loss, the kind that altered the human geography of the place and made the distances between remaining households feel longer. The Garfields stayed. They'd stayed through every hard year since Margaret had ridden out to see them in the drought of 1886, and by 1894 Thomas Garfield had become one of the more capable operators in the area, his record-keeping modeled on the Rowan ledger system, and his crop rotation influenced by a combination of Bauer's winter wheat knowledge and 2 agricultural journal articles that had circulated through the book-sharing arrangement. His wife had 3 children now and ran a side operation pressing and preserving food products in quantities sufficient to sell a modest surplus at the Harlow market. They were not prosperous. Nobody in Calhoun Flats was precisely prosperous. But they were stable in the specific way that comes from having learned what you needed to learn before the bad year arrived. During the drought of 1894, Margaret did something she'd been thinking about for 2 years without being fully certain it was the right thing to do. She wrote to the Harlow Territorial Gazette, the same paper that had run Silas's original advertisement 11 years earlier, and offered a monthly column on practical agricultural management for frontier households. Not advice exactly, more documentation, what was working, what wasn't, what the collective knowledge of the Calhoun Flats community had learned through trial and the considerable cost of error about managing an operation through the specific challenges of Montana's climate and geography. The editor, a man named Price, who'd been running the paper for 20 years and had a journalist's instinct for what people would actually read, wrote back within 2 weeks offering her 8 column inches per month and no payment, which she accepted because payment hadn't been the point. She told Silas about it after the arrangement was confirmed. He looked at her across the kitchen table. "You've been writing it," he said. "It wasn't quite a question. I've been thinking about it for 2 years. I've been writing it for 6 weeks." 6 weeks? I wanted to see if it held up before I mentioned it. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding, as he sometimes did, whether to be irritated about the sequencing or simply to engage with the substance. He chose the substance, which was one of the things about him that she'd come to count on. "What does it say?" "The first one is about crop rotation in low moisture conditions. The second one is about record keeping for small operations. The third one, the one I haven't finished yet, is about building community resource networks in isolated settlements." She paused. "That one is about what we've been doing here, the gatherings, the book sharing. I think other communities at distance from towns like Harlow are trying to solve the same problems independently, and what we've learned could be useful to them." Silas looked at the table, then back at her. "You're going to put our names in it." "My name. I'm the one writing it." "People will come here." "Some might. Is that a problem?" He thought about it seriously, which she'd learned to distinguish from him appearing to think about it while having already decided. "No," he said. "I just want to know what I'm agreeing to." "You're not agreeing to anything," Margaret said. I'm telling you what I'm doing." Something moved in his face that was not quite amusement and not quite exasperation, the particular expression she'd catalogued over 9 years of marriage as meaning he'd been precisely correctly answered and was acknowledging it. "All right," he said, "let me read the first one before it goes." "I was going to ask you to," she said. "Your read on the drainage section will be useful. You know that field better than I do." He read it that evening at the kitchen table while she put the children to bed, a process that took longer than it theoretically should have, because Edmund had found something mechanical in the bedroom that required disassembly before he could be persuaded towards sleep, and Clara had questions about a passage from one of the books that had circulated through the sharing arrangement. Questions that were specific and required actual answers rather than the general redirection that worked on younger or less attentive children. Robert at 9 was already enough like his father that getting him to bed was less a struggle than a negotiation, and Margaret had learned to approach it as such. When she came back to the kitchen, Silas had the draft in front of him and a pencil he'd used to mark 2 places in the drainage section. Here, he said, pointing. This is almost right, but the timing's off. The drainage issue in a Montana context is worse in the melt period than it is during summer rain, because the volume is different. You've described it as primarily a summer problem. Because most of my information came from the summer observations. The spring melt observations are in the ledger from 88 and 91. He slid the pencil to the second mark. And here, you've said the east field correction cost $40. It was closer to $55 because of the additional grading work in the second year. She looked at the marks. I'll correct both. The rest of it is good, he said. The part about the record keeping will be useful to people. This from Silas was a thorough endorsement. The column ran for 9 years through the remainder of the drought and into the better years that followed. It developed a readership that surprised Price enough that he eventually offered payment, which Margaret accepted and put directly into the book fund. Letters came to the Gazette and were forwarded to the ranch, GE, from families in other parts of the territory, from a woman in Wyoming who'd started a similar gathering arrangement based on the column's description, from a man in eastern Colorado who'd implemented the record-keeping system and written to report that it had helped him identify a pattern in his yield losses that he'd been unable to see before. These letters she kept in a box in the bedroom. She didn't show most of them to Silas, not because they were private, but because she knew what he'd do with them, read them, set them down, say something considered and accurate. And she wanted them to remain hers for a while. These small evidences of a thing that had started with 2 rocking chairs and a newspaper advertisement and had extended in ways neither of them had mapped or planned far beyond the boundaries of their 40 acres. Dutch Holloway died in the spring of 1897 in his own house on his own land, which was exactly what he would have wanted. Silas was there, having ridden up on a Tuesday morning to find him already diminished past the point of the gradual decline they'd all been tracking. He stayed the rest of that day and the day after, handling what needed handling, and he came home on the Wednesday evening with the particular quality of grief that men of his type carry, entirely internal, entirely present, expressed in nothing so much as the fact that he sat in the left rocking chair for a long time after supper without moving and didn't want coffee when she offered it. She sat in the right chair and they stayed there until the dark came fully down. He told me something once, Silas said, eventually. The first winter I was here. He rode by and I was trying to fix the well pump in weather too cold to be working metal, and he watched me for a while, and then he said, "You'll lose 2 hands doing it that way." A pause. He was right. I almost did. I stopped and waited for a warmer day. Margaret looked at the dark prairie. He had a talent for being right about practical things. He had a talent for saying the true thing without making you feel like an idiot for not knowing it yourself. Silas was quiet for a moment. That's harder than it sounds. I know, she said. I'll miss him considerably, Silas said, which was, for Silas, close to as complete a statement of grief as he was capable of making, and she accepted it as such. The ranch in 1898 was not the ranch of 1883, or even of 1886. It was not simply larger, though it was larger, 62 acres now, the disputed 12 secured permanently. Additional acreage to the north purchased during a period of good yield in the early 1890s at a price that the ledger system had confirmed they could sustain. It was different in the way that things are different when years of deliberate effort have been applied to them. Not polished, not finished. There was never really finished on the frontier, but shaped. The barn had a proper roof for the first time in its existence. The back bedroom had been rebuilt from the studs out the winter that Robert was 4. A project that Silas and the Prentice men completed in 3 weeks, and that produced, incidentally, a bedroom without a single gap in the boards, which closed out a minor chapter of imperfection that had run for 15 years. The porch still had the 2 rocking chairs. They'd been replaced once. The originals had finally given out in the early 1890s. The wood dried past the point of safe use, and Silas had gone back to Becker and Harlow, only to find that Becker had retired and his son was running the workshop. The son built chairs to the same specifications, from the same material, and they were good chairs, but they were not the originals, which was a small loss that neither of them made more of than it was. One morning in September of 1898, Margaret came out to the porch and found Robert, who was 9, sitting in the left chair. He was reading one of the agricultural journals with the concentrated frown of his father, his feet not quite reaching the porch boards below. She stopped in the doorway and looked at him. "That's your father's chair," she said. Robert looked up. "He's in the field." "I know, that's still his chair." The boy considered this with the specific seriousness of a child encountering an unspoken rule for the first time and trying to understand its logic. "Why is it his chair?" he asked. "It's just a chair." Margaret looked at both chairs in the morning light, the left one occupied by her son with his journal, the right one empty the way it had been empty for so many years before she'd arrived to fill it. "Sit in the right one," she said. "Why?" "Because the left one was the one that was already there," she said. "The right one is the one that was built for someone." Robert moved without further argument, settling into the right chair with his journal, and Margaret went back inside to start the morning's work. She did not explain further, and he didn't ask again, and the logic of it, partial as it was, incomplete as all real explanations of significant things tend to be, settled into the household the way most true things settled there, without ceremony, simply by becoming part of how things were. The years after 1898 moved the way years do when the major battles have been fought, and the landscape has settled into something recognizable. Not without difficulty, not without loss, but with a different quality of difficulty than the early years had carried. The frontier kind of hard, the raw existential kind that asked whether you would survive at all, had given way to the ordinary kind of hard, which was still genuinely hard, but which came with the advantage of a structure beneath it. The ledgers were current. The land was secured. The children were growing into people who had opinions and made problems of their own, which was its own kind of evidence that something had worked. Robert left for the State Agricultural College in Bozeman in 1906 at 17, carrying a trunk that Margaret had packed with the same systematic thoroughness she applied to everything, and a letter of introduction to the college's dean that she'd written 3 drafts of before being satisfied. He went with his father's handshake and his mother's list of things he should not forget to do, and he did not cry at the station, which Margaret took as proof that he was more his father's son than he perhaps knew. Clara followed 2 years later, not to college, but to a teaching position in Harlow. She had decided by age 14 that she wanted to teach, and had not wavered from this, which was the most Rowan thing about her. And Edmund, true to August Bauer's early diagnosis, ended up apprenticed at 17 to a mechanical engineer in Great Falls, who wrote back to Silas and Margaret after the first month to say that the boy had already identified an inefficiency in the shop's press mechanism that had been costing them time for 3 years. Silas read that letter at the kitchen table and said nothing for a moment. Then, "He got that from you." "He got the mechanical aptitude from somewhere else entirely," Margaret said. "Neither of us has mechanical aptitude." "He got the habit of looking at a system and finding where it's losing efficiency," Silas said. "That's yours." She considered this. "Maybe," she allowed. The house was quieter with the children gone, which was an adjustment that affected Silas more than Margaret, or at least affected him differently. She'd always required a certain quantity of internal silence, and had spent the children's years learning to find it in shorter increments. The return of extended quiet felt, to her, like recovering something she'd lent out for a long time and was glad to have back. For Silas, who had built the house in the first place around the concept of filling it, the emptying of it carried a different weight that showed itself mostly in how he worked. Longer hours, earlier starts, the physical absorption of a man whose mind required occupation. She noticed this and said so, directly, the way she'd always said things. "You're working too long," she told him one evening in the spring of 1910, when he came in from the field after the light had been gone for 20 minutes and ate supper in the distracted silence of someone who hadn't fully come back from where they'd been. "There's work to do," he said. "There's always work to do. There was work to do when you stopped at dusk for the previous 20 years. He looked at her. "The north fence needs the full line walked." "It does," she said. "Tomorrow, in daylight. Not tonight in your head." She set down her fork. "The children being gone is strange. I know that. It's strange for me too, differently." He was quiet for a moment. "The place is too quiet." "Yes. I built it to have people in it." "People are in it," Margaret said. "2 people. The original number." Something moved across his face. Not quite amusement, not quite relief, more the specific expression of a man being accurately located by another person. "2 people rattle around in it more than I expected," he said. "We'll adjust," she said. "We've adjusted to harder things." He picked up his fork. "We have," he said, and the conversation moved on, the way their conversations always moved, directly to the point, briefly past it, and then onward, without lingering in the emotional territory longer than it needed to be occupied. The gatherings at the Rowan house continued into the new century, though their character changed as the community around them changed. The original group from those early drought year Thursdays had thinned with time and distance, and the ordinary attrition of frontier life. Some had died, some had moved on, some had sent their children in their place, which was its own kind of continuity. By 1905, the gatherings had become multi-generational in composition. The Garfield children sitting where their parents had sat, Bauer's granddaughter, who'd inherited the winter wheat knowledge, presenting it now with the authority of someone who'd grown up inside it. Margaret's column in the Gazette had eventually transferred to a larger territorial paper that picked it up in 1902 and had been running for 13 years by the time she finally stopped writing it. In 1904, not because she'd run out of things to say, but because she'd said what was useful to say, and repeating herself seemed wasteful. Price wrote her a letter when she stopped, which surprised her. He said the column had been the most consistently practical thing the paper had published in his tenure, and that he'd received more forwarded copies of specific installments than he'd received of anything else, ever. He asked if she'd consider writing something else. She wrote back that she'd think about it, and then didn't, and eventually concluded that thinking about it was its own sufficient answer. Silas's health began its slow renegotiation with him in the winter of 1912, when he was 62 years old and had been working the same land in the same Montana weather for nearly 30 years. It was not dramatic, it was never dramatic with him. He wasn't built for dramatic. But it was consistent, a stiffness in the mornings that took longer to walk off than it used to, a dryness in his lungs during the coldest weeks that the physician from Harlow, a younger man now named Connolly, who'd taken over the practice, said was accumulated effect of decades of winter work. He was told to moderate his outdoor hours in the hard cold, which he interpreted as generously as possible, and Margaret interpreted more strictly, and their management of this disagreement over the following 2 winters constituted one of the longer-running arguments of their marriage. "I know my own body," he said one February morning when she'd pointed out that the temperature was below what Connolly had specified. "You know your body the way you knew the drainage in the East Field," she said, accurately in general and incorrectly in specific. "That's not fair." "It's completely fair." She handed him a second coat. "Wear this." He took the coat with the expression of a man choosing his battles. He was good at choosing his battles, always had been, which was part of why their arguments had the quality they had: compressed, direct, and resolved without extended residence in grievance, because neither of them had the patience for extended residence in grievance. Robert came back in 1913, having finished his college education and spent several years working for an agricultural extension service in the southern part of the state. He came back not because the operation needed him. It had been running without his physical presence for 7 years and was sound. The systems his mother had built too embedded by now to require constant management. But because, as he told them both over supper on his first night back, he'd been watching other operations in the state fall into problems that the Rowan records would have predicted and prevented, and he'd decided that what he wanted to do with what he'd learned was bring it back to the place where he'd first seen it work. Margaret looked at him across the table. He was 24 now. Her son, with his father's jaw in her eyes and a quality of considered directness that she recognized as the product of both of them and neither of them entirely. "You're not coming back to take over," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Robert said. "I'm coming back to add to it. There's a difference." Silas looked at his son for a moment. "You know the fence line needs walking." "I saw it coming up the road," Robert said. "I'll start on it Thursday." Silas nodded once, and that was the entirety of the welcome, which Robert understood completely because he'd grown up understanding how welcome was expressed in this house, not in words but in the simple assignment of work that needed doing, the implicit trust that you were capable of doing it. The last genuinely hard year was 1916, which delivered a late frost that took the early crop, a summer that recovered adequately but not fully, and an October storm that came off the mountains with 48 hours of warning and required the entire operational infrastructure they'd built over 30 years to get through without significant loss. Robert handled the livestock. Margaret managed the stores and the coordination with neighboring properties, 3 of which had younger operations that were closer to the margin. Silas worked the fields during the days the weather allowed and managed the equipment problems that the cold produced with the same deliberate economy of movement that Margaret had first noticed during the barn roof crisis 20-some years before, slower now but still reliable. Still the man who became still inside himself when the situation required it. They lost the north grain storage to the storm. The structure went on the second night, the roof failing under ice weight in the early hours. A sound that brought them both awake and sent Silas out into the dark to assess it, while Margaret lit every lamp in the house and began accounting for what had been inside. He came back in after 20 minutes, snow in his hair, and stood in the kitchen doorway. "It's gone," he said. "The whole roof." "How much was in it?" "A third of the fall grain." He looked at the floor for a moment, the look of a man running numbers he didn't want to be running. "We can cover it. It's tight, but we can cover it." "I know," she said. "I already checked the ledger." He looked up at her, snow still melting in his hair, 66 years old and tired in the specific way of a man who has absorbed a great deal over a long time and is still absorbing. She was 59, and she was tired too, and the lamp on the kitchen table threw the same kind of light it had always thrown, unsteady and warm, the same light they'd sat in for 30 years of evenings. "We should have replaced that roof 2 years ago," he said. "Yes," she said. "We should have. We'll replace it in the spring." She set the ledger down. "Come sit down." He came and sat down, and she poured coffee that was left from the evening and was not good anymore but was hot. And they sat at the kitchen table in the middle of the October storm and went through the numbers together the way they'd always gone through the numbers, directly and without pretense about what they showed. It was tight. It was manageable. It would require some adjustment to the spring plans and a careful winter, but it was manageable, and they both knew it, and knowing it together in the same room at the same table was different from knowing it alone, which was the thing that had always been true and would always be true and didn't require saying. Silas died in the spring of 1921, which was the 35th year of their marriage and the 38th year he'd worked the Montana land he'd built the 2 chairs for before any of the rest of it existed. He died without drama, the way he'd lived. In the house, in the bedroom, with the rebuilt walls that had no gaps in the boards. With Robert there and Clara, who'd come from Harlow, and Edmund, who'd driven through the night from Great Falls when the telegram reached him. Margaret was there. She'd been there the whole of the final week, which was the week that made itself clear as final, sitting with him in the evenings the way they'd always sat together, not always talking. On one of the last evenings, when he was still lucid but diminished in the way that the end of things diminishes them, he said, "I should have fixed the kitchen window earlier." She looked at him. "What?" "The kitchen window frame. It warped in the first winter and I never quite straightened it. You can see the angle if you look at it directly." A pause. "Always bothered me." "I fixed it myself in 1904, she said, "while you were in the North Field." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know that." "I know you didn't." "You should have told me." "You would have wanted to redo it." Something moved in his face that was, despite everything, the expression she'd catalogued years ago as the one he made when he'd been precisely correctly answered. "Probably," he said. She took his hand, which was something she'd done throughout their marriage without ceremony. The way you hold the hand of someone you've worked alongside for decades, not as a declaration but as a simple fact of proximity. "The Eastfield drainage," she said. "You were right about the spring melt timing. I was wrong about that in the first column. You corrected it in the third one. I know, but I was wrong first." "You were wrong about the timing," he said. "You were right about everything else." "Not everything." "Most things," he said. And then, after a pause, "The chair worked." She looked at him. His eyes were closed now, and his breathing had the quality it had had for several days, effortful and slow, but there was still that slight expression at the corner of his mouth that she recognized. "The chair worked," she agreed. He was gone by the end of that week, on a morning in April when the light was coming in through the repaired window at the correct angle, and the prairie outside was doing what it always did in the first week of April, attempting green with the particular tentative insistence of something that had survived another winter and was not entirely sure yet that it was safe to proceed. Margaret sat on the porch that afternoon in the right chair, which she had always occupied, and looked at the left chair, which was empty in a way it had not been empty since she'd arrived at the Harlow station 35 years ago, and asked whether it was still there. It was still there. That was the thing. It was still there, and it would remain there because removing it would have been a misunderstanding of what it was. She sat for a long time without moving, which was unusual for her. She was not a woman who sat still well, never had been, and the prairie habit of the porch evenings had always been an accommodation she'd made to Silas's slower gear rather than to her own natural rhythm. But she sat there now and let the afternoon move across the grass the way it moved, and thought about the specific arithmetic of 35 years, which was not an arithmetic of addition and subtraction, but something more like the arithmetic of geological processes. Slow accumulation, pressure, the transformation of raw material into something harder and more permanent than it had started as. She thought about the letter she'd written at 27 at her father's print shop counter, the fifth draft, the one she'd written quickly because careful writing kept failing and she'd needed something true rather than something correct. She thought about the months of correspondence, the specific weight of an envelope that had traveled from Montana to Chicago by train and horse, and whatever else moved letters across that distance in winter. She thought about the station platform at Harlow and the question she'd asked and the single nod that had answered it, and how that nod had seemed at the time almost insufficient and had turned out to be exactly right. The human tendency, she'd observed it in other people and knew it existed in herself, was to look back at a life and organize it into a story that made sense, that had a logic running through it that the actual living of it never quite had. To say, this led to this, and therefore the whole thing was inevitable, which was a comfort but also a small lie. Nothing had been inevitable. The letter could have gone unwritten. Silas could have given up during the 2 years of her father's illness and found a different arrangement with a different woman and built a different life. And that life might have been adequate or might have been less than adequate, and either way would have been a life. The second chair could have remained empty. These things were not inevitable. They were chosen, repeatedly, in the specific way that important things are chosen. Not once, dramatically, but again and again in small decisions that accumulated into a direction. That was what she hadn't known at 27 and knew now at 62. That love was not the dramatic decision. It was the Tuesday morning decision, the February cold decision, the 4 days without telling me decision, and its aftermath, the barn roof and the land dispute and the drought and the children leaving and the north storage collapsing in the October storm. It was the 10,000 ordinary choices to stay and work and be honest about what wasn't working and fix it and keep going. The rocking chair on the porch was not a symbol of romantic faith. Or not only that, it was a statement about the kind of person Silas had been before she knew him, someone who prepared a space for another person rather than waiting to see if another person was worth preparing for. That had always been the real thing he'd told her in the advertisement, the thing beneath the sentiment, that he'd already decided she mattered before she existed in his life, that the space was already there, already waiting, with the particular kind of patience that could only come from someone who believed the waiting was worth it. She hadn't been certain she believed that when she came. She'd been curious about it, which was different, and curiosity had been enough to get her on the train, and the train had been enough to get her to the station, and the station had been enough to get her to the wagon, and the wagon had been enough to get her to the porch, and the porch had been enough for everything that followed. The following week she went through his desk, not because there was urgency, but because it was a thing that needed doing, and she preferred to do necessary things promptly, rather than let them accumulate weight through postponement. His desk was organized the way his mind was organized, apparently sparse, actually very deliberate. Everything in a place that had a reason she sometimes had to work out by thinking about how he thought. The correspondence was in the left drawer, organized by year going back to the early 1880s. The land documents were in the center, behind the current ledger. In the right drawer, beneath a survey map of the property and a spare pencil and a folded piece of oilcloth that she couldn't immediately identify, was a bundle of papers she didn't recognize. She took them out and unfolded them. They were drafts, multiple drafts, in his careful, deliberate handwriting, each one crossed out and continued below. She recognized the project immediately. The newspaper advertisement, the one he'd placed in 3 papers in the autumn of 1883, the one she'd found in the Midwest Daily Register on a Thursday afternoon while supervising a press drum repair. She'd never seen the drafts. She'd only ever seen the published version, which had been edited to fit the column space. She sat at the desk and read them. The early drafts were different from what had been published, more formal, more careful, more constructed. You could see him working towards something he hadn't quite reached yet, crossing out the sentences that sounded like what a man was supposed to say in favor of what he actually meant to say. The fourth draft was close to the published version. The fifth was the published version, or nearly so. But beneath the fifth draft, in handwriting that was different, not different in style but different in quality, the handwriting of a man writing something private rather than something to be read, the handwriting of his late years, slower and more deliberate than the careful script of his 30s, was a note. Not long. A few lines. She read it once, and then she sat very still. She came. She sat in the second chair. I was right to build it first. What I did not write in the advertisement because I did not yet know it and could not have known it. The chair was not built for a wife. It was built for this specific woman who did not exist yet in my life, and who proved over the years that followed to be the right person for every reason I had anticipated and a dozen I had not. The waiting was not the hardest part. The hard part was everything that came after, and it was worth it entirely. She set the papers down on the desk and looked at the window. The kitchen window, the one whose frame had warped in the first winter, the one she'd repaired herself in 1904 without telling him, and that he'd noticed only at the end of everything. The light came through it at the correct angle now, the way it had for 20 years, clean and unobstructed. She did not cry, which was not because she didn't feel what there was to feel, but because she'd lived long enough to know that the deepest things didn't require tears to be real. They required acknowledgement, which was different, and she acknowledged this privately and completely, sitting at his desk in the morning light. Robert found her there an hour later, when he came in from the field to check on her. "You all right?" he said from the doorway, with his father's directness and his mother's dark eyes. "Yes," she said. She held up the papers. "Do you know what these are?" He came in and looked at them. "The advertisement drafts?" "You knew he kept them." "I found them once when I was young, looking for something else. He didn't say much about them." Robert looked at his mother. "What did you find?" She handed him the note. He read it, and something moved across his face. Not the expression she'd have expected, not sentimental, but something more complicated and more genuine than sentiment. The expression of a man understanding something about his parents that he'd known partly and now knew more completely. "He wrote that later," Robert said, "after you came." "Yes." "He kept it in the drawer with the drafts." "Yes." Robert handed it back. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her with the assessing quietness of a rowan in the presence of something that mattered. "What are you going to do with it?" Margaret looked at the note. She thought about boxes kept under beds, about letters organized by year, about columns in the Harlow Gazette that had run for 9 years and reached families she'd never meet in territories she'd never visit. She thought about what it meant to build a record of a life, which was not the same as the life itself, but was the evidence of it, the proof offered to whatever came after that the life had been deliberate and considered and worth the effort of its own continuation. "I'm going to keep it," she said, with the rest of the correspondence. She walked out to the porch in the afternoon, the note folded in her pocket, and sat in the right chair. The left chair was empty. The prairie did what it had always done in April. It moved under the wind in long, slow waves, the new grass bending and recovering, the way living things do when they're rooted deep enough to survive what comes at them. She sat there a long time. The second chair had never been empty in any way that mattered. That was the thing she understood now that she hadn't understood at 27 or 30 or 40. That the space prepared for you before you arrive is not a presumption but a form of faith. And faith was not the word she'd have chosen then, carrying all the weight she'd once assigned it. But it was the word that fit now, stripped of everything except its most accurate meaning, the decision to act as though the future would be worth preparing for. He had prepared. She had come. Everything else was the life they'd made from those two facts, imperfect and costly and unglamorous in the specific ways that real things are unglamorous. And it had been enough. More than enough. It had been, when she sat with it honestly in the afternoon light on the porch of a house they'd built together from the ground up, exactly sufficient for everything it had needed to be. The wind moved across the grass. The left chair was still. And Margaret Rowan, who had once been Margaret Ellison of Chicago, who had once been the woman who answered a peculiar advertisement about a second rocking chair in a Montana newspaper, who had built ledger systems and book-sharing networks and monthly gatherings, and a column that ran for 9 years and 3 children and 62 years of a life she had chosen with her eyes open. Margaret Rowan sat in her chair and looked at the prairie and breathed the cold April air and stayed. She stayed a long time, and the chair beside her, empty as it was, did not feel empty at all.